What's happening, folks? In today's video I want to show you the street photography camera settings that I use on the Fujifilm X100V. Now first of all, I'm not saying that this is the best way to set your camera up. I'm not saying it's the only way to set your camera up. I'm not saying this is how you should set your camera up necessarily. But this is how I do it, and if you're interested in figuring out a better way for yourself, you're trying to suss out the camera, then this is how I do it. You give it a try and see if it works for you. So first of all, let's start with the basic exposure settings and stuff that I use that you can set on the outside of the camera. The main thing I do is I shoot at f8 as much as I can. And I also shoot in manual focus, and I set the focus to about 10 feet as standard, and that gives me everything from about 6 feet almost to infinity will be pretty much in focus. And I like to do that so that I don't have to like focus and recompose or think too hard when I'm out walking the dog or just walking the streets and shooting photos. It takes that whole sort of consideration of focusing on things out of my mind. And if something is a lot closer to me and I want to focus on it quickly, I just pull the focus thing back to round about 3 or 4 feet. I'm not very accurate with it because it's not mechanical. Then I can shoot something closer up and then put it back to 10 feet and I'm usually good to go. For the exposure settings, all of the time actually, I'll put the ISO to auto and I'll control exposure with the compensation if I need to. I'll have the shutter speed on most bright days, I'll set it to automatic, but if I specifically want frozen motion, I'll set it to a 500th or maybe a 1000th depending on the situation. So that's it for the outside stuff. Let's move into the menu settings that I use. So moving into the menu section of the X100V, I'm going to just work my way through these menus, and starting off in the image quality settings, I'll leave the image quality on RAW. Sometimes I'll shoot fine plus RAW if I want a JPEG in there as well, but most of the time I'll use the RAW file or I'll create a JPEG with the RAW conversion in camera. RAW recording is set to compressed, so that lossless compressed, so that the file size is not ridiculous. Film simulation, now I use a recipe that I found on Fuji X Weekly, and it's the Kodachrome 64 recipe, I think. That starts off with the base of that is the classic chrome simulation. However, I'll change it a little bit just to suit my needs. I'll leave the grain effect off instead of on weak, which it would normally be on. The color chrome effect is on strong. Color chrome effects blue is on weak. On the next page, the white balance is on auto, but then the white balance shift on the Kodachrome simulation would be blue -5, red +2, and I just knock it back a little bit so that it's a little bit less warm in some situations, and I prefer it that way. So I know that it makes it less like the actual Kodachrome simulation, but just tweaking it myself, I've found that I like the colors that way. Dynamic range is set to 100. Dynamic range priority is off. I don't know what it does anyways. Tone curve is all at 0. Color is +2. Sharpness at 0. Noise reduction at 0. The long exposure noise reduction is on. I very rarely use long exposures, to be honest. I think I'm just going to put that to off, because I can always reduce the noise in the raw file anyways. Color space, sRGB, all the custom settings. That's for your Q menu, so if you want to save different ones, you can save them all in there. That's my Kodachrome one saved right there. That's the one that I'm using all of the time basically. Moving on to the autofocus manual focus. I'm in manual focus just now, so the AF mode isn't available there. If I switch it, AF mode all, so that I can cycle through any of those without having to go into the menu system. So I'll leave it on that. I don't touch that. Store AF mode by orientation, I don't know what that is, so I'll leave it alone. AF point display is off. Number of focus points is 117. You can have 425. To be honest, I find that to be way too many when I'm using autofocus. 117 works just fine. Even that is probably more than I'd like. Pre-AF is off, because again, I don't know what that does. AF illuminator is off because I don't want a light to
light up on the front of the camera to sort of give away to someone that I'm taking a picture. Face detection, eye detection is off. It's easy enough to map that to a button if you want to use that on a regular basis. AF plus MF is on, so I can still use the back button focus here when I'm in manual focus, so that I can still have some access to autofocus without having to switch it. MF assist is on peak, focus peak highlight with red highlights. I've been through a few of them and I like the red highlight ones, so I stuck with that. Focus check is off, kind of ignored these ones. The depth of field scale I switched to the film format basis. Pixel basis, the scale shows very little being in focus, and I guess that's more based because it's like digital, so it can tell better if something's not in focus. The film format shows more of what would be in focus on film, and I think what happens there is there's like a level of acceptable focus, and basically everything looks in focus at f8, but the pixel basis shows it to be a much shallower depth of field. So I like it on the film format one because for my eye, that's what's all in focus. I ignore that. AF range limiter is off. Touchscreen mode is off. I have a button on the actual screen that you can cycle through these, but I like to leave that off as much as I can. Corrected AF frame off. Okay, the shooting settings. Sports finder mode off. Self timer off. Just ignore all that. I don't really mess around with these things. I'm not film simulation bracketing or anything. Don't deal with the multiple exposures really. Photometry, I have it on average. This might be something to do with my problem with the camera often underexposing things, because it's probably taking into account bright areas that it doesn't need to. And if I was going to do a portrait or something, then you do spot metering and it'll meter for the spot that your focus point's on. Center weighted is pretty clear. And multi, I forget exactly what that does, but average works well for me. If I'm shooting weddings, generally I'll use spot metering because you're metering for the people and you want them to be properly exposed and sometimes less worried about the background. But yeah, for street photography, I quite like average, and I don't mind brightening a picture up in post. Shutter type, I've got it on manual. I've got it on mechanical. Flicker reduction is off. ISO setting is on auto 3, and the settings I have set to that is from 1/160th to 12,800, and the minimum shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. So if the shutter speed is on automatic, it won't go below 1/250th of a second. So usually things are pretty sharp and frozen at that, but if I want to go below that speed, I can change it on the dial on the top and still get slower speeds if I want. ND filter is off, but I have that mapped to a button on the front of the camera, so I can get it quickly if I want to. Flash settings, ignore that. I very rarely use flash. I'm going to ignore the movie stuff. Now, sound setup, I turned all of the noises off so the camera doesn't make any noise, because I don't like when it makes noise. And yeah, that's pretty much that. It keeps it a bit more low key when you're shooting street. The view mode setting, I usually use the eye sensor thing, so it'll show LCD image, and then when you put your eye up to the viewfinder, it'll switch over. Also have that mapped to a button up here, so I can switch that if I want to. EVF brightness is auto, and color, I haven't messed around with any of that. I just leave it as it is. Image display is off because I don't want it to sort of distract me while I'm shooting by showing me the pictures I'm taking. Auto rotate displays is on, so if I turn the camera in portrait orientation, the displays will move. I don't know if I want that. I think I want that off. I think I've been finding that a little bit annoying recently, so I'm actually just right now going to switch that to off. Preview, exposure, white balance in manual mode. I have exposure and white balance on that. Natural live view off. I want to see my film simulations. The framing guideline I have on grid 9. So I got that rule of thirds guideline if I want it. Auto rotate PB. I think that means the pictures, because then if you take a portrait orientation picture, it'll show the correct way up on your screen. Focus unit scale feet, that's just whether you prefer feet or meters. So the focus lever setting I have on. One of the problems I had with this camera before I had the thumb rest was I would knock this focus lever here, which is what I'm moving through the menu with. And you can set it to this so that you can push it to unlock it. So I guess that was Fujifilm's answer to people knocking that by accident. But I just find that to be cumbersome to have to click it first and then move the focus point. If I just leave it on, it will move the focus point without me having to do that. I think I just don't have the brain power to like, the less things I can add, like less steps I can add to get to something, I would rather do that. So I like to leave it on, and then the thumb rest just saves me from knocking that by accident. Edit and save quick menu, 16 slots. These function settings here are just everything I've got mapped to all of the different buttons on the camera. So function 1 is this one on the top right hand side of the camera here, and that's for the view mode. So if I want to change from LCD to EVF only, then that's the button there. The button on the front that's next to that lever thing is what I have for the ND filter. The upward swipe is for the flash. The left swipe is for depth of field preview. The right is for white balance, and down is for the autofocus limiter. I don't really use any of these touch functions, to be honest with you, so I mapped them to what I would possibly use the most, but I don't really use them anyways. So this button here I have mapped to AF on. That says AFL, AF lock only. I guess it's like the AF on. I call it AF on, I think, because of Canon, and I guess this is Fuji's version of AF on is what they call it. And the command dial, if I click that, will do like a focus check. Something else that I don't really use that much, maybe AF on would be better on this button, but actually I think I like it there because the thumb rest kind of curves around it nicely. And then the turning, and if you pull and hold the dial that usually you would use to switch to your EVF or OVF, and just hold it for a second, that will do the flash setting. Again, I don't really use that, but I like to have access to the flash settings if for whatever reason I suddenly want to use flash. And the Q button is set to the Q menu, which I feel like makes sense. Command dial settings, to be honest, I don't really use those settings. If I'm going to change anything, I tend to change it on the dials up the top. I'm not changing my shutter speed that often, and if, you know, a lot of the time I'll just use it in automatic mode, or if I want to set a specific shutter speed, I'll set it on the top dial. It's how I've developed that sort of muscle memory with Fuji, and I'm just more comfortable not bothering with these dials anymore. Initially I really wanted these dials, but the more I've shot with the camera, the less I've really felt the need to use them. These ones I don't really touch. The focus ring I have set to clockwise. Most like manual focus things go kind of counterclockwise. So you would turn it clockwise to focus closer and counterclockwise to focus to infinity. I have that the opposite way on this camera because in my mind that felt like the more sensible way to go, and I'm worried that this is probably setting me up for failure whenever I get a camera that has mechanical focusing, and it's probably going to take me a long time to rework that muscle memory. Focus ring operation linear. Non-linear, I think it'll change depending on the speed that you move the focus ring at, whereas linear makes it a little bit closer to if you had a manual mechanical focus or not. Whereas linear makes it a little bit closer to if you had a mechanical focusing mechanism. Kind of. It still doesn't feel the same, but that's what I use. Touchscreen settings, I have not messed with them, but they're still on. Although I don't really use them. Auto power off, I have on off. So if I leave the camera on, it's not going to go to sleep or switch itself off. One of the things I don't want it to do is be on sleep mode when I'm quickly trying to take a picture on the street. I would rather be switching it on and off with the dial on the front, and then I know if it's on or off. And I think that is everything.
So after about 4 months of shooting, that is how I've came to have this camera set up. It hasn't changed much in the last month or two. I think I've got this pretty much down to how I want it to be. I really enjoy shooting with this camera. It's easily been my favorite camera to carry around on a daily basis. As I mentioned before, this might not be how you would want to set up your camera. If you prefer to shoot at f2 and get nice shallow depth of field, then you're probably going to want to shoot with single point autofocus or continuous or something like that. Maybe even putting face and eye detection on so you can get people in focus if that's what you're looking for. But particularly since getting into street photography, I've came to love shooting at f8. And that's why I stick with manual focus, get everything in focus and work on my composing and finding interesting scenes that way. Drop me a comment down below, tell me if you've tried any of this stuff out or if you like to have your camera set up completely differently from me, and because as I say, it might work for me and not for you. But anyways, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. I make new photography videos every week. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.